Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. This is Eisenherz and today I have a crazy long gameplay video for you guys. This game was a 3-hour grindfest. Usually I don't show these super long games on my channel, but I wanted to edit this one down and present it to you guys because it showcases pretty well what Urza does best. So let's have a look at the opening hands. Flo goes first on his Najeela list. His opening hand consists of Ancient Tomb, Windswept Teeth, Wooded Foothills, Ignoble Hierarch, Arcane Signet, Professional Facebreaker and Fierce Guardianship. He kept this hand because it has a turn 2 Najeela and he could follow it up with a Facebreaker for tons of value. Scipio is second in turn order with his blue farm list. His opener has Gemstone Caverns, Polluted Delta, Scrubland, Red Elemental Blast, Soul Partition, Rhystic Study and Touch the Spirit Realm. He kept this hand because it allows for a turn 2 Rhystic Study and he has some removal for 3 commander-centric decks. Memo's third with his Timur Pirates list. He mulled to 5 and kept the hand with Taiga, Gaia's Cradle, Allosaurus Shepherd, Eldritch Evolution and Finale of Devastation. For his London Mulligan he put Force of Negation and Snap under his library. He kept this hand because he already mulled down to 5 and he had tutors for both Dockside and Glinthorn Buccaneer. I go last with my beloved Urza Power Scepter list. I kept my second 7 with Snow-Covered Island, Saprosan Scary, Jeweled Lotus, Sensei's Top, Gilded Drake, Winter Orb and Counterspell. I kept this hand because it was really dope. It guaranteed a turn 1 Urza with a follow-up, as well as interaction and a Drake against commander-centric decks. All the decks can be found in the description box below, and now let's get started with the grindfest. Scipio starts the game with the Gemstone Caverns in play. He ditches a Soul Partition. Flo draws for turn. He plays an Ancient Tomb. Casts an Arcane Signet and follows up with an Ignoble Hierarch. He then passes. Scipio draws, plays a Polluted Delta and cracks to grab a Volcanic Island. He then casts a Grim Monolith and passes. Memo draws for turn. He plays a Command Tower, follows up with an Allosaurus Shepherd and passes. I draw for turn, play Saprosan Scary tapped, cast a Mana Crypt, follow up with a Jeweled Lotus, and then I crack it to cast Urza Lord High Artificer. On ETB I make a Construct token, and I use the floating mana to cast a Sensei's Divining Top. I then pass my turn. Flo untaps, draws for turn. He plays an Arid Mesa and cracks it to grab a Volcanic Island. Casts a Mox Diamond and ditches a Windswept Teeth. He then casts Najeela and I react to it by casting a Counterspell. But Flo has an answer and he casts a Fierce Guardianship, paying 3 mana for it. Najeela resolves, and Flo passes. Scipio untaps, draws, plays a Scrubland. He then casts a Rhystic Study, and passes his turn. Memo untaps, draws, plays an Ancient Tomb, and for 3 mana casts his commander Malcolm. Rhystic Study triggers and Scipio draws. I then move to my turn, untap, draw, play Snow-Covered Island. I pay 4 mana to cast Karn, the Great Creator. Rhystic Study triggers and I pay for it, tapping an island. I then activate Karn and shoot the Mox Diamond. Pass my turn. Flo untaps. He draws for turn. Plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it to get a Scrubland. And he casts a Professional Facebreaker. heuristic study triggers, but Flo pays for it. He then moves to combat, and he gets a ignoble hierarch trigger and a Najeela trigger. Professional Facebreaker triggers twice, so he makes 2 treasure tokens and passes. Skip your untaps and draws, and passes his turn. Memo untaps and draws. He plays a Gaia's Cradle and casts Finale of Devastation for X equaling 2. Heuristic Study triggers and Scipio draws a card. Finale resolves and Memo gets a Gilded Drake to steal the Professional Facebreaker. He then moves to combat with Malcolm and his Alazol Shepherd, and he makes 2 treasure tokens from the Facebreaker and 1 from Malcolm. At the end of Memo's turn, I activate my Sensei's top, rearrange the top cards, and go to my turn. I untap and draw. I uptick Karn to crack one of the treasure tokens, and I don't take any further game actions, hold up mana, and pass my turn. Flo untaps. He draws for turn. He plays a Wooded Foothills, cracks it to get a Tropical Island. He moves to combat, gets 2 Najeela triggers, and then passes his turn. Scipio untaps, draws, and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it for a Badlands, and casts his commander, Tymna. Scipio passes, Memo untaps, he draws for turn, plays a Mana Confluence, he then casts a Heuristic Study of his own, which triggers Scipio's Heuristic Study, and in response, Flo casts a Mystical Tutor, which also triggers the Heuristic Study. Flo pays for the top trigger, Mystical Tutor resolves, Flo puts New Form on top of his library, and the Heuristic Study resolves, and Scipio draws another card. Memo then attacks, gets 2 more Professional Facebreaker triggers and 1 more Malcolm trigger. At the end of Memo's turn, I activate my Sensei's top, rearrange the top cards, and move to my turn. Untap and draw, activate Karn again to crack one of the treasures, but in response, Memo activates the Professional Facebreaker to exile his top card. I then pass my turn, Flo untaps, he draws for turn, just the Neo form, he then moves to combat and gets 4 Najeela triggers. After combat, Flo decides to cast the Neo form, sacrificing one of his treasures, which triggers 2 Heuristic Studies. Flo pays for it and gets an Esper Sentinel into play. He passes his turn, Scipio untaps and draws. And he plays an Imperial Seal, which triggers the Heuristic Study and the Esper Sentinel. He doesn't pay, so Flo and Memo get to draw, and Scipio puts a card on top of his library. Then moves to combat with Tymna, draws the card on top of his library and casts a Toxic Deluge for X equaling 1 in order to destroy all the warrior tokens. Heuristic Study triggers and Memo gets to draw. Finally, Toxic Deluge resolves, and all the 1/1s are gone. Scipio then passes, Memo untaps, and draws for turn. He casts a Phantasmal Image, and has it enter as a copy of Tymna. He pays for the Heuristic Study, and then moves to combat with Malcolm and his Professional Facebreaker. He creates 3 more treasures on combat, and then activates Tymna in his second main to draw 2 cards. Finally, he starts cracking treasures to dig into his library, reveals a Fierce Guardianship, cracks 1 more treasure, and reveals a breeding pool. He cracks 1 more treasure and reveals a windfall. Memo decides to play the breeding pool. He then casts his second commander, Tana, not paying for the Rhystic Study. At the end of Memo's turn, I activate my Sensei's Top again to rearrange the top 3 cards. I then move to my turn, draw, play Snow-Covered Island. I cast a Soul Ring, which triggers 2 Rhystic Studies and the Esper Sentinel, and I pay for the Rhystic Studies. I then activate Karn again to crack 1 of the treasures. And I also cast a Winter Orb, now that a lot of lands are tapped. This triggers 2 Rhystic Studies, and both Memo and Scipio get to draw a card. I then pass my turn. Flo untaps and draws. He plays a Tundra. And he casts an Intuition targeting me. 2 Rhystic Studies trigger. Flo doesn't pay, and both Memo and Scipio get to draw. Intuition resolves, and Flo fetches up Rhystic Study, Savines, and the Derevi. We decide to give him the Savines. Flo then moves to combat and has a Najeela trigger, and then passes his turn. Scipio untaps a land and draws, and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it to get a Tundra, and passes his turn. Memo untaps. He draws for turn. Plays an Exotic Orchard, and moves to combat with Malcolm and the Professional Facebreaker. He gets 2 Facebreaker triggers and a Malcolm trigger, creating 3 more treasures. Then Tymna triggers in a second main, and he draws 2 cards. That's a lot of value every turn. Memo then casts a Sylvan Safekeeper, paying for Rhystic Study. He activates Professional Facebreaker and cracks treasures to flip top cards of his library. He reveals a Pact of Negation, Simian Spirit Guide, cracks 1 more treasure, reveals his Swan Song, even more interaction. He casts a Sylvan Library, triggering Esper and Rhystic Study. He does not pay, and Sylvan Library resolves. At the end of Memo's turn, I activate my Sensei's Top again to rearrange the top cards. I untap and draw. I cast a Kill the Drake, 2 Rhystic Study triggers, and I pay for them. And I decide to steal the Esper Sentinel. I then uptick Karn to crack 1 of Memo's treasures. And I move to combat with my construct. I then pass my turn. Flo untaps 1 land because of the Winter Orb. He then draws for turn. He moves to combat with his Gilded Drake. He then passes his turn to Scipio, who just untaps, draws, and takes no game actions. And Memo untaps, and he has a Sylvan Library trigger. He decides to only take one card, so his life total doesn't get too low. He plays a Taiga as a land for turn, and goes to combat with Tana, creating 2 Saprolings. He has a Professional Facebreaker trigger for 1 more treasure. He then cracks them to flip into a City of Traitors and a Misty Rainforest. Not a lot of very good cards there. He then has a Tymna trigger, pays 1 life and draws a card. He casts a Veil of Summer, triggering both Rhystic Study and Esper Sentinel. He counts all his creatures and the mana Guy's Cradle makes, then pays for the Rhystic Study, but I get to draw from the Esper Sentinel. Veil of Summer resolves. And Memo has some tricks up his sleeve. He casts Alchemist Retrieval, targeting my Winter Orb, triggering the Rhystic Study. In response, I tap the Winter Orb to float a blue mana. And with Alchemist Retrieval still on the stack, Scipio channels Touch the Spirit Realm, targeting my Winter Orb. Gets exiled, and Alchemist Retrieval fizzles. Memo then cracks a treasure into Professional Facebreaker, flips another card, which is a Daze. He then casts Eldritch Evolution, triggering the Rhystic Study and sacrificing 1 of his Saproling tokens. He does not pay, and gets a Dockside Extortionist into play, creating a ton of treasures, which he can sack into Professional Facebreaker. He does just that, flips into a Force of Will, continues, flips into a Tinder Wall. He casts the Tinder Wall, doesn't pay for the Rhystic Study, so Scipio draws, and he continues to flip into a Flusterstorm, a Force of Negation, lots of interaction there, continues to flip into a Last Chance. He continues and flips into a Deflecting Swat, basically all the interaction he has in his deck. He continues cracking treasures to see what he can get, basically drawing a ton of cards, and there is the red Elemental Blast, even more interaction. Memo thinks and cracks 1 more and flips into Otawara. At this point he's already mad. He cracks 1 more and flips into Boseiju. There you can see his reaction. That's just incredibly unlucky. And he cracks 1 more, his last treasure, and flips into a land. Memo decides to sacrifice his Tinder Wall for 2 red, and he then casts, who would have thought, Last Chance. Rhystic Study triggers, and Scipio gets to draw cards. Last Chance resolves, and Memo moves to his extra turn. My Winter Orb comes back into play untapped, so Memo can only untap 1 land. Memo untaps, and in his upkeep, Flo decides to cast a Silence, which triggers 2 Rhystic Studies and the Esper Sentinel. Memo casts a Mental Misstep, which triggers the Esper Sentinel and the Rhystic Study. Esper Sentinel and Rhystic Study let us draw cards. And with Mental Misstep still on the stack, young Scipio decides to cast a Pact of Negation, but only after politicking with me to tap the Winter Orb before his next turn so he can untap. This again triggers Rhystic Study and Esper Sentinel. I get to draw a card, Memo gets to draw a card, Pact of Negation counters the Mental Misstep, we get to draw from Esper Sentinel and Rhystic Study triggers, and then finally Silence resolves. Memo has a Sylvan Library trigger, he just takes one card, he plays a Steam Vents untapped, and then dies. And at the end of Memo's turn, I activate my Sensei's Top again to rearrange the top cards. I move to my turn and untap. I draw a card, play a Misty Rainforest and crack it for a Snow-Covered Island. I then cast a Solve the Equation. I do not pay for the Rhystic Study because I'm thinking that I'm free to combo off at this point. Skip your draws, and I two-drop a Dramatic Reversal into my hand. I then continue by casting a Weir of Invention, X equaling 2, triggering Rhystic Study, not paying. Skip your draws another card, and he then decides to Red Elemental Blast my Weir of Invention. I get to draw from Esper Sentinel. I cast a Force of Will in response, pitching a Witching Well, which triggers the Rhystic Study again. Skip your draws another card. And with Force of Will on the stack, Flo decides to crack his treasures into Professional Facebreaker to dig for interaction. He gets a Final Fortune. He cracks one more treasure. And he gets a Tainted Pact. Force of Will is back on the stack, and Scipio decides to cast a Deflecting Spot. Yep, there it is, free interaction with Tymna out. I dig for an answer with my Sensei's Top, look at the top 3, rearrange them, but unfortunately I have no answers, and Weir of Invention finally gets countered. I then downtick Karn to get the Witching Well back into my hand from exile, and I pass my turn. Flo untaps one land because of the Winter Orb. He draws for turn. And he casts a Savine's Reclamation, triggering the Rhystic Study and the Esper Sentinel. He pays for the Rhystic Study, but I get to draw a card from the Esper Sentinel, which by the way is a 2-2 because Flo got it with Neoform, which puts a 1-1 counter on it. That's why nobody's paying basically. With Savine's Reclamation on the stack, I decide to cast a March of Swirling Mists, pitching the Witching Well, which I just got back, for X equaling 2. Rhystic Study triggers, and with the trigger on the stack, Flo casts a Deflecting Swat, which again triggers Rhystic Study. So I'm trying to get rid of Najeela, and Flo is just trying to deflect it so he can win with the Derevi that's in this graveyard. I then pay 2 mana to cast a Dramatic Reversal, which again triggers the Rhystic Study. And I tap my Construct to float a blue mana. Scipio gets to draw from the top Ristic Study trigger. Then Dramatic Reversal resolves, and I untap all my non-land permanents. So all my mana is available again. And with the Ristic Study still on the stack, I activate my Sensei's Divining Top to rearrange the top 3 cards. I have 1 mana floating. And I decide to tap my Sensei's Top to draw the top card and put Sensei's Top on top of my deck. And I then use the floating blue to cast An Offer You Can't Refuse. And there's a Ristic Study trigger, which I pay for with the floating mana of my Sol Ring. I counter the deflecting spot with my offer. And with the Ristic Study trigger still on the stack, Flo decides to use the treasures to look into his library with Professional Facebreaker. But he doesn't find an answer. Ristic Study triggers resolve, Scipio draws cards, March of Swirling Mists phases out the Professional Facebreaker and Najeela, and finally Flo gets his Derevi back with the Savin's Reclamation. Flo then untaps a land with the Derevi trigger because it ETB'd. He moves to combat. I take 3 damage. And the Derevi trigger untaps another permanent, which is a land. That makes sense. With Winter Orb out, that's a great way to break parity on this stacks piece. At the end of Flo's turn, I tap my Winter Orb, as I promised, to Scipio, so he can pay for his pack trigger. He draws for turn, and plays a Spire of Industries. He casts a Lotus Petal, triggering my Esper Sentinel. And I get to draw a card. Lotus Petal resolves, and I go to my turn. I draw. Play an Ancient Tomb. I then cast a Mox Opal. Scipio draws from Ristic Study. I cast a Sensei's Top. Scipio draws from Ristic Study. I activate the Sensei's Top with my floating mana from Sol Ring to rearrange the top cards. I then pay 2 to cast a Sapphire Medallion. Scipio draws from Ristic Study. I uptick Karn to shoot the Lotus Petal. I cast an Imposter Mech, triggering the Ristic Study. Scipio draws. I have the Imposter Mech enter as a copy of Gilded Drake, but with the trigger still on the stack, I tap it to float a blue mana. And then I use the Gilded Drake ETB to steal the Derevi. So I got a Derevi now, and Flo's got 2 Gilded Drakes again. I then move to combat, swinging with my Esper Sentinel, or Flo's Esper Sentinel, my Construct, and Urza. I deal damage and get 3 Derevi triggers to untap my permanents. I then pass my turn. Najeela and Facebreaker face back in. Flo untaps a land. And he draws for turn. Flo casts a Gamble, triggering Ristic and Esper Sentinel. We both get to draw. Flo tutors up a card and he has to discard it. It's Claim the Firstborn. That would have gotten him the Derevi back, and with that he could have probably won the game, Najeela. But yeah, gamble is a gamble, right? He has to discard it. Flo then moves to combat with his professional Facebreaker. He deals damage and gets a treasure token. And at the end of Flo's turn, Scipio casts a Vampiric Tutor, triggering my Esper Sentinel. I tap 1 to activate my Sensei's top and rearrange the top cards before I draw from the Esper Sentinel. I then draw a card, and Scipio gets to tutor up a card on top of his library. He then untaps a land and draws. He plays a Wooded Foothills, cracks it to get a Volcanic Island. And there's Memo, he's back. Scipio then passes, and at the end of his turn I activate my Sensei's top again to rearrange the top 3 cards. I then move to my turn, untap everything, which is a lot at this point, huge board state. I draw for turn. And I cast a Reality Chip, paying for Rhystic Study. Tap 3 to equip the Reality Chip to the Esper Sentinel. The Reality Chip should actually be tapped, but it didn't come up. I'm then able to play cards from top of my library. I play a Flooded Strand. And I cast a Counterbalance. With Counterbalance on the stack, there is a Rhystic Study trigger, so Scipio draws. He then casts a Chain of Vapor, which triggers the Esper Sentinel. I draw, and Karn gets bounced back to my hand. I don't continue the chain, because I don't want any more pieces of my board to be bounced. Counterbalance resolves, and I cast an Arkham's Astrolabe from the top of my library. Scipio gets to draw, and I get to draw from the ETB. I then cast a Gitaxian Probe from the top of my library, which triggers the Rhystic Study again. But Scipio lets us have a look at his hand. There's a Simian Spirit Guide, a land, Rite of Flame, Swords, Underworld Breach, Swan Song, Force of Will, Pyroblast, and Culling the Weak. I draw from the Git Probe, and I know that Scipio has a dope hand, a lot of interaction and a way to win the game, so I have to be careful. I move to combat, swinging the Revi and my construct at Scipio, as well as the Esper Sentinel and Urza. Before blockers, Scipio casts a Pyroblast by exiling his Simian Spirit Guide, targeting the Revi. In response, I pay 2 to cast a Mana Drain from the top of my library. Scipio gets to draw a card from Rhystic Study, and he responds to the Mana Drain by casting Swords to Plowshares, targeting my construct. I get a Counterbalance trigger, and in response to the Counterbalance trigger I crack Flooded Strand, get Mystic Sanctuary and put an offer you can't refuse back on top of my library. I reveal it with Counterbalance and counter Swords to Plowshares. Mana Drain counters the Pyroblast, and Scipio has to block my Construct. He gets 2 life from Tymna and he goes down to 3, and I have 3 Derevi triggers to untap 3 permanents. I then activate my Sensei's Top again with the Mana Drain mana to rearrange the top 3 cards. This is relevant because I don't want my opponents to know what card is on top, so they cannot play around the Counterbalance. I pass my turn, Flo untaps, he draws. Plays a Tarnished Citadel. At the beginning of his combat, I cast Resculpt targeting Najeela. Scipio gets to draw from Heuristic Study. Najeela gets exiled and Flo gets a 4/4 token. He moves to combat with his Drake. Or let's say with his Drakes. Both in the air, both coming at me. I take the damage because I want the Derevi to be in play. He gets 3 Face Breaker triggers and 3 treasure tokens. He casts an Underworld Breach, triggering Heuristic Study, Esper Sentinel and Counterbalance. And I reveal from the top of my library a Fairy Mastermind, which counters the Underworld Breach. I then get to draw a card, and so does Scipio. Flo is not finished yet. He exiles a Simian Spirit Guide and flashbacks Savine's Reclamation. Which triggers the Heuristic Study and the Counterbalance. So I activate my Sensei's Top again, because I have the mana, right? And I rearrange the top cards. And ooh, what do we got there? I reveal a Fabricate, which counters the Savine's Reclamation. And as a last effort, Flo cracks treasures into Professional Facebreaker. He flips into Grim Hireling, Thassa's Oracle, and finally into a Demonic Tutor. But unfortunately he can't do anything with those. Scipio goes to his turn, he untaps, and he draws from the Heuristic Study, which he forgot before. And he draws for turn. He plays a Forbidden Orchard. He taps, giving Flo a Spirit token. He casts a Rite of Flame, triggering Esper Sentinel and Counterbalance. I draw from the Esper Sentinel, and then I reveal the top card, which comes back around. The offer you can't refuse. Rite of Flame gets countered, and Scipio passes his turn. At the end of his turn, I activate my top again to rearrange the top 3 cards. I mean, Counterbalance plus Sensei's Top plus Reality Chip is just such a value engine. I can control basically everything, because I can look at the top cards of my library at any point and rearrange them however I want. Pair that with Mystic Sanctuary and you got yourself a way to counter basically everything. So I untap, draw, play the Snow-Covered Island. I then move to combat, swinging my Derevi as well as my Esper Sentinel at Scipio. I just want to be safe here, so I attack him with 2 creatures. Both would be lethal on their own, but in case he has any shenanigans, I just swing both. And he dies. I get 2 Derevi triggers to untap. And Flo is tapped out. I have a way to counter basically everything that he plays. I also think Flo is hellbent at this point, so I just go for a Muddle the Mixture. I transmute it to get Power Artifact. I then cast the Fabricate to create a Grim Monolith. I cast the Grim Monolith. I cast a Power Artifact, make infinite mana, put it into Urza Lord High Artificer, and now I can perform spell loops, make infinite creatures, bounce everything, and just win from there. GG. Well, what can I say? This is what Urza can do really well. Control the board, be a huge pain in the ass, and win in the late game. The MVPs in this game were probably Karn and Winter Orb, which basically slowed down the game on their own. And in the later part of the game, Counterbalance and Sensei's Top definitely helped me to secure my position and get the win. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. If you managed to watch the whole video and enjoyed it, please leave a comment, like the video, share it with your friends, and of course, subscribe to my channel. This is Eisenherz and auf Wiedersehen.